Good evening and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that is definitely probably wearing assless chaps right now. You don't know. I'm V. LaBianca. My co-host tonight probably has at least a couple pieces of leather gear in his repertoire, Christy Powell.
Howdy.
And joining us tonight is Wrath, a horror and erotica writer, a former heavyweight kickboxing champion, former MMA fighter, dungeon owner, and BDSM educator who teaches about leather and kink. Whew, that's a lot. Welcome, Wrath.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I've had a colorful life.
Sounds like it. I'm excited to dive in tonight. We're going to be talking about leather culture, but first, Christy, where can people find us?
Yeah, that's right. We're talking about all things leather. So whether you're curious or already well cured, give us a call. We're at 512-991-9242, 512-991-9242, or at tiny.cc/callsex, where you can reach us for free from anywhere in the world.
Wonderful. All right, let's jump in. So, Wrath, before we jump into leather culture and everything that has to do with that, let's talk about you a little bit. What brought you into this particular subculture, and why do you find it appealing?
So I actually got into the kink community back in the early 90s when I was probably too young to be doing the things I was doing, and been in and out over the last 30 years or so. And leather has always been an interest of mine because I find it sexy and empowering. And the leather culture, the values and traditions and values that it has always been something that appeals to me because as a martial artist, respect, integrity, discipline, those are things that I've always valued. I've been a martial artist since the age of 12, and there's a lot of cross between those values and that lifestyle.
Interesting.
And I'm kinky, so there's that.
And that. Well, it
all goes together.
So, walk us through a little bit. What is the history of leather culture? I know that it kind of came on the scene in the U.S. at least in around the 1940s, and then 1960s and 70s. It actually ended up getting involved in a lot of the movements for gay rights and the AIDS crisis and all of that. So it does have a pretty rich history here in the U.S. Do you want to walk us through a little bit of kind of the leather culture over the years?
Yes. So I think most people would agree that it kind of evolved out of World War II, the leather biker culture. There's the hyper masculine look of the leather culture definitely comes from military uniforms, from biker culture, movies like Marlon Brando and the Wild Ones, those type of things, which, Marlon Brando, he looked pretty cool. Why wouldn't you want to emulate that? And it also afforded gay men at that time a sort of armor, because guys in leather who look like bikers, they did not immediately associate them with gay culture. They looked tough. They looked scary. Cops were afraid to go into leather bars when bars were being raided, gay bars were being raided, so on and so forth. You were less likely to approach a man dressed like a biker and assault him or anything else because they were scary looking. And scary's sexy too. I mean, I love fear play.
Sure.
So and as a horror writer, that also appeals to me. I think anything that makes you look a little more intimidating is kind of hot. So, but
that's why I cut all my hair off.
There you go. Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Over the years, more heterosexual people have joined the leather community. There was when I actually started investigating the leather community, I was kind of surprised to see that there was a such thing as that leather had evolved beyond just the LGBTQ community, that it had embraced everyone. And we're still working on that. I mean, there's still, diversity is still a journey. It's a goal. And not just, we're talking racial, nationality, religious diversity within the leather community. That's still a goal. And that's something that every year is a big issue in the leather community, because we want to be expansive and inclusive and welcome everyone. And it can, tradition, as they say, is kind of peer pressure from dead people. And so there is a lot of resistance to leather changing, because leather does have a very rich culture and a very rich history and a very rich tradition. And sometimes that can feel a little oppressive, and it can feel a little exclusionary. And so we're always pushing boundaries to welcome different types of people and different types of expressions of leather. When I first was investigating the leather community and interested in joining, one of the things that actually turned me off was the very militaristic look of leather. I saw a lot of people who looked like police officers, and given the kind of contentious history of Black Americans with law enforcement, it was not something I was interested in. I didn't, and some of them looked sort of Nazi-esque. Also, not something I was interested in, because I didn't want to. To me, leather, when I thought of what leather was to me and the look that I wanted, it was sort of like Richard Roundtree in Shaft, or Avery Brooks in A Man Called Hawk, or even Morpheus in The Matrix. It wasn't so much Marlon Brando, and I didn't know if there was room for me to express my leather in that way. And now you are seeing all kinds of different expressions of leather, and that's great. That's great, and we definitely welcome and encourage that. That's the long answer, I guess.
Fascinating. No, long answers are good on this show. I like it. That is really interesting, and it puts to mind. I read this book called The Gay Agenda, and I mean, Linda Hirschman is the author, and she wrote about this thing called the 4-article rule, which was an unofficial way to designate who was gay back in the 1940s and 50s. And if you were wearing more than 3 pieces of clothing that were for the opposite sex, you would get arrested, you get beaten up, you get pulled out of a bar. That was a thing that you had to worry about. So I'm imagining that this kind of culture is another way, or was at the time, another way to signify I am divergent, I am different. This is me asserting my sexuality and my inclusion in this community without having to worry about that part of things, and being attacked essentially for wearing clothes that were traditionally feminine.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, in the 80s, when lesbian leather became more prominent, I'm sure that the reverse effect was wearing a woman dressed very masculine in leather was probably a target, because now it's clearly saying I am a lesbian, rather than there being any question. And I know I was in San Francisco in the 90s, and there seemed to be, I was very shocked to discover very hard lines in San Francisco between the gay and straight community, which I hadn't experienced in LA, or even in Philadelphia. I hadn't experienced such strict lines between the two. And there was almost if you were straight, you had to announce it proudly. If you were gay, you had to announce it, and there wasn't as much harmony as I would have expected. And I remember the leather community fighting to be included in the gay pride parades, because they didn't want, because we were weird,
Wow,
and we were controversial, and we didn't, gay rights was a big topic. We were LGBT community was fighting for acceptance, and they didn't want anything that might give them a reason to go, you're too weird.
Yeah.
And so it was very hard. It was very hard for leather folk to gain acceptance on either side, straight or heterosexual or LGBTQ. We were the outlaws on both ends, so.
That's very, very interesting and not at all surprising. Unfortunately, there is that tendency to be like, we're normal, we're just like you. Don't look at us differently. So anything that is different or pushes that envelope a little bit is, automatic, like stuffed back in the closet. Like, oh, we don't pretend you didn't see that. When in fact, most of the time, those people are the ones who made the biggest strides towards equality and actually getting those rights to begin with. I love this. I could talk the entire night about the history of it. I do want to get into these traditions, or this rich tradition that you've mentioned as kind of being both something that's very valuable and very much cherished in this community, but also something that maybe there's a little tension with as new people enter. Can you walk us through what some of those traditions are and why they're so deeply held?
So what's interesting is I think a lot of the traditions leather is constantly in flux, but if you ask someone, it sounds like it's been stagnant for years. We like to talk about our very strict traditions, like earned leather is a big thing in the leather community. Earned leather meaning that someone has gifted you leather because of your contributions to the community. And it's a very big tradition in our community, and it's a big badge of honor. Getting covered as a master in the community by your peers as a recognition that you are a leader in the community is a huge thing. However, I remember sitting in on a class with someone who is an elder in the leather community discussing the first covering ceremony he'd ever attended. And this was someone who had been in the leather community since the 60s. And the first covering ceremony that they'd ever attended was in the 90s. And he was saying how during the ceremony, they were talking about how this is something that is handed down since the 40s and 50s, and it's how it's always been done, so on and so forth. And he looked around and said to other people who were around his same age and was like, we didn't do this. I've never seen this before. But and he made a very good point. He said, don't put words in the mouths of dead people. If you want to create a new culture, a new tradition, feel free, but don't, try and say, oh, this is how it's always been done. And a lot of that tends to happen. Because the reality is that there were, we didn't have the internet back then. So everything wasn't as homogenous as it is now. There was, depending on what city you were in, what leather bar you were in, traditions were different. There's now a big tradition about wearing run pins on your leather vest, and that's been around for a long time. However, if you were in this, let's say in the 60s or 70s, and you poked a hole in your leather to put a pin on it, people would have thought you were crazy. You had because leather is expensive. So you had a denim vest over your leathered biker jacket, and that's where you put your pins. And so now when people talk about, oh yeah, this is a tradition that's been around forever, yes and no. Yes and no. Traditions evolve, and it really, like I said, it depends on what area, the culture, the country you were in, what bar you were affiliated with, what family, what group. Cultures varied. Now there's a lot more uniformity than there was before. So,
would you say that's a good thing, or does that kind of? I'd imagine there's something lost there too, if you're not able to go to, say, Philadelphia versus Los Angeles and see just a completely different iteration of that culture.
Well, I think it helps in some aspects because you can, once you know the general rules, because there are some rules and some traditions that are widely acknowledged and widely accepted. And that's, again, largely because the internet, we can all kind of agree, from not just in America, but all over the world, we can all kind of agree that, hey, yes, this is what we're going to call leather, and this is how we're going to do it. And so when you go to Philadelphia, or you go to Canada, or you go to Florida, and you walk into a leather bar, it's not as unfamiliar as it may have been 30, 40 years ago. And so there is a comfort. I do kind of know the rules, and it's not like you have to relearn everything all over again. So in that aspect, I think it's awesome. I think it's great. I know with me, when I first entered the leather community, I don't do things kind of halfway. I don't like kind of ease my way into things. I just kind of was like, hey, I'm here. And I didn't do the earned or gifted leather. I bought my leather and just walked in. And that's how I did. And then I was running for titles and doing all this stuff, because that's just how I do things. And I probably broke all kinds of rules and busted all kinds of traditions. In fact, I'm positive I did. But it was easy to find out. I could go online and go, oh, okay. All right, I won't do that again. Now I see, whereas, like I said, 30 or 40 years ago, I would have just been kicked out of a bar, probably.
Yeah, to hear you describe it, it's almost like a secret society. And now people are maybe more empowered to find their people and to join into the culture. So that feels like a benefit. But I hear what you're saying, V, about that, maybe that sense of loss, or that loss of culture in a way. And I'm just really excited to have you here, I guess, to kind of share bits and pieces of that history with our audience.
Yes. And so the thing is that, as much as, just like with anything, when you have the older generation who has their cultures and their traditions, and then you have the next generation that comes around and they want to change things, there's always some friction. And so there's friction in our community. Sure. And it's interesting when you talk about cultures and traditions and the way things are, and someone had talked about the changes from just the 80s to now. How back in the 80s, it was common to see someone in a leather biker jacket and white jeans. That was a common leather look. And you would never see that nowadays. You would never see that. You also, now it's common to see people wearing kilts. You would have never seen that back in the 80s. So it is always evolving, but there's always seems to be some resistance to it. And I completely understand. I'm one who does long for the past, and I do love tradition and love the rules and all of that, because, and again, I think that goes back to my martial arts background. I still cringe when I see kids walk into a dojo and walk on the mat with their shoes. It just drives me crazy. So I completely get it.
I'm actually very curious about that crossover that you mentioned earlier, which is you found that there were very many similarities between martial arts and leather, and kind of that crossover, that valuing of respect and discipline and all of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that intersection?
Yes. So, my trainer was I called him Master, which is, MS in the leather and kink community is a big dynamic. And I was used to calling someone Master. And there was a layer, I didn't talk back to him. When he gave me an order, I did it. There's a great story about he was using me as a demo for, he was showing his new kick. Not new, but new to me, a new kick. And he threw this kick, and I put my hand up to block it, and his shin cut into my bicep, and my arm just went dead, and I dropped my arm. Then he went to throw the kick again, and I stood there. I couldn't defend myself, couldn't raise my hand, and he stopped at just the right second didn't land the kick and kick me in the head and knock me out, which he by all rights could have. And he said, you can't raise your arm, can you? And I said, no. And he pulled the kick down, and everyone looked at me like, you were going to let him kick you in the head? And I was like, yeah, it's my master.
What you do, right?
Exactly. And that type of loyalty and obedience is not uncommon in, master-slave dynamics in the leather community. I always think about that when I see the type of love and respect and that you see in the leather, it's particularly in those MS dynamics. I always think about how I was with my master, my sensei, my crew, as I was going through different martial arts. It's very similar, very similar. I remember.
Very interesting. And we're going to talk more later about kind of how leather culture is portrayed in the media and the stereotypes or maybe assumptions that mainstream audiences might have about leather. But I'm fascinated by the fact that I never made that connection, but I can see that very clearly. And in mainstream culture, it does feel like one of those, the martial arts side of that, is often very romanticized and very much like, of course, this is a dynamic that you would strive for and even like really, really want and cherish, versus a lot of the times the master-slave dynamic is fetishized or even vilified as something that's like weird or gross or whatever. Like it's presented in a very different light, even though, yeah, you're right, those dynamics are very similar.
Yeah, or even presented as abusive. You watch all those old Run Run Shaw movies, and it's common to see the master training the pupil by caning him or her, caning them, and we don't blink. But if you were to see that in an MS dynamic, which you do, then for the average vanilla person, they would be horrified. And they would think that's abusive, but yet you just applauded it watching Kung Fu theater.
Right. Interesting. Oh, I want to do like a whole series on this. This is amazing stuff. We're going to take a call after, but I do have one more question for you, and this is something that came up in my research for this interview. What's the Leather Hall of Fame, and how does one get into it?
So the Leather Hall of Fame, it recognizes people who have made a significant contribution to the leather community, people and organizations, excuse me. You're nominated and by your peers, and that's how you get into it. I'm not in the Leather Hall of Fame. I'm too young for that, but it's an annual thing. And it's definitely a big honor. We're in the leather community. We're very big on ceremonies and celebrations and honoring each other and honoring, because service to the community is one of our highest values in the leather community. So honoring that with titles, with as we said, with awards, it's a big thing, and I think it helps encourage that. Especially now when everyone is going through so much in and out of the leather community with, our current person in the White House and COVID-19 and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think anything that encourages us to give back to people and help one another, I think is amazing and valuable. And that's one thing that I think people who are outside of the leather community don't see enough of. They don't see how much we give to each other and support each other, and how much of it is really about charity and giving. They don't see that. They just see the guy in the leather or the woman in the leather cracking the whip and so on and so
Right.
forth. And that's their whole image of it. And it's mostly about relationships, interpersonal relationships, love relationships, and our relationship to the community as a whole. That's really most of what it is. The kink is almost secondary to that. I mean, because of COVID-19, a lot of us haven't played in months. I haven't held a whip in months, but I'm still leather, and I still interact with the community, and I still give back to the community. And that's how I feed my leather, is by giving to the community, not by whipping someone bloody, although
Right.
that's fun too.
Oh, that's fun. Well, I just want to say
think it's
thank
just
you
an
for being
important-
responsible during COVID and giving up some of those fun bits to make sure that everybody's safe. We like to kind of nail that home on these shows, just congratulating people when they're taking it seriously. Christy, I think I interrupted you. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess only to highlight that there are so many places in whether we're talking about the kink community or the queer community or just so many spaces outside of that like vanilla cis het world where people are interacting with each other in, sexual or maybe non-sexual ways where sexuality is still a piece of the community and a gathering point. And I feel like that's something that's missed out on in our broader culture. And I see people as really missing out on an opportunity, not just for expression and community, but for opportunity to protect one another. You're talking to us about how leather community came together as a form of protection. And I mean, that's the same reason that people are hosting munches and providing opportunities to have some safety from predators and everything else. But it's not just that piece. It's not just about safety. It's about lifting each other up. And I think there's a lesson there for our broader culture that's maybe being missed out on.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. As a horror writer also, I remember when I was going to put together an online horror convention as a result of, as a response to COVID-19. And people thought, whoa, that's going to be difficult. Well, the leather community had already thrown 3 by the time I'd announced it, because we took COVID-19 seriously right off the bat. And we still, because one of our values is community service, we still wanted to serve the community. We still wanted to give people the education, the fellowship and interaction with one another. We still wanted to provide that. And so right away, we began putting together online conventions. And it was just funny to see everyone else being like, whoa, how can you do that? That's going to be hard. And I was very proud that our community kind of led the way in that.
That is amazing. I love that. And honestly, just to shout out the ACA here for a minute, I feel like we were kind of in the same boat, right? We were like the week that everything shut down, we had moved online already. Everyone was ready to go. We set everything up and we continued to be there for the community that we had built. And it's a struggle, right? Where we're giving up a lot in order to make these accommodations and stay in touch with everybody. But it's necessary, right? Like we cannot abandon the community just because we can't be there in person.
Absolutely.
All right, let's jump into, sorry, go ahead, Rath.
I was just going to tail on to that. One of the things that I personally did was I have friends who are slaves or submissives who were not attached to a dominant or not attached to a master, who were really feeling the loss of that dynamic and the interaction with people. And a lot of people were in that situation. I know a lot of slaves who reached out to masters who didn't have slaves to just kind of make sure they were okay. And the other thing was people who were in dynamics, but they weren't living together, now were isolating in different houses and couldn't interact. And it was just that seeing the community checking in on everyone, me checking in on people checking in on me, everyone checked in to just say, hey, how are you doing? I know you're struggling because you can't express your leather, you can't play, you can't see your master or your slave or so on. And we all checked in on each other. And, I was proud to see that because it really reinforced the idea that this is a community. And I know we have our struggles and our disagreements. And like we talked about earlier, where the people who have been around a lot longer versus the new folks who are coming in trying to change everything. There's that kind of dissonance and that kind of friction. But when it comes down to it, we all come together. And that's really what leather is about, is just supporting one another.
I love that. I can empathize.